I found my 7-year-old nephew unconscious in a locked closet, while his stepmother posted pictures of her perfect life online. When I called for an ambulance to save his life, my own brother sent the police to arrest me. My name is Jasmine, and my family has always called me the overly aggressive black woman because I refuse to stay quiet and play along with their games. Let me tell you how a simple visit to my brother Terrence and his wealthy white wife Ashley turned into an absolute nightmare, and how I used my skills as a forensic accountant to tear their fake empire down to the studs. The summer air in Atlanta was thick and humid that Tuesday afternoon when I pulled my car into the sprawling driveway of my brother's million-dollar mansion. Terrence is a celebrated investment banker who loves to show off his wealth. Ashley spends her days curating a flawless aesthetic on social media portraying the ultimate blended family. Jamal is the son of Terrence and his late first wife Alicia, who was my absolute best friend in the world. Ever since Alicia passed away, I made it my personal duty to check on Jamal as often as I could, despite my family's constant complaints that I was too overbearing. The front door was slightly ajar, which was the very first sign that something was terribly wrong in that pristine house. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the massive foyer. It was completely spotless but eerily silent. I called out for Jamal but heard no answer echoing back. I walked past the immaculate living room where Ashley usually films her parenting advice videos for her thousands of followers. A faint scraping sound caught my attention, making me pause in my tracks. It was coming from the dark hallway tucked underneath the main sweeping staircase. I followed the noise to a heavy wooden utility door that was secured with a deadbolt from the outside. My heart pounded against my ribs as I undid the heavy lock and pulled the door open. The foul smell of urine and stale hot air hit me instantly, making my stomach turn. I fumbled frantically in the dark for a light switch along the wall. When the bare bulb finally flickered on the sight before me, made my blood run absolutely cold. Jamal was curled into a tight, helpless ball on the bare concrete floor. He was wearing clothes that were clearly days old, and his small frame looked terrifyingly frail. He was severely malnourished, with his little cheekbones jutting out sharply against his pale skin. His breathing was incredibly shallow and ragged. I dropped to my knees right there on the hard floor and pulled his limp body into my arms. He was completely unresponsive to my voice. Panic seized my chest, but my emergency training from years ago immediately kicked in. I laid him flat on the cold concrete and checked his pulse with trembling fingers. The beat was dangerously faint. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed emergency services right away. I quickly gave the operator the exact street address and explained that a young child was unresponsive and barely holding on to life. The operator told me that an ambulance was on the way and instructed me to begin chest compressions immediately. I placed the heel of my hand on his fragile chest and began pushing downward while counting out loud in the empty house. With my free hand, I managed to send a desperate text message to both Terrence and Ashley, telling them to get home right now because Jamal was dying. While I breathed air into my sweet nephew's failing lungs, my phone vibrated on the floor beside me. It was a reply from Ashley. She told me to stop being so dramatic, Jasmine. She typed that Jamal was just throwing another tantrum for attention like he always did. She instructed me to lock the door back up and leave the house immediately. Then she warned me not to dare call an ambulance and ruin her husband's pristine public reputation. I read those cruel words and felt a wave of pure rage wash over my panic. I ignored her sickening message and kept doing compressions with all my strength. Tears streamed down my face as I begged Jamal to please hold on just a little longer. The wail of sirens finally echoed down the quiet suburban street, bringing a rush of hope. Paramedics rushed through the open front door with their heavy medical equipment and oxygen tanks. They took over the life-saving measures immediately and lifted his tiny broken body onto a mobile stretcher. I stood up, shaking with adrenaline and deep relief, ready to follow them outside to the waiting hospital transport. But as I moved toward the doorway, heavy footsteps pounded aggressively up the paved driveway, or local police officers stormed into the grand foyer, blocking the only exit. They completely bypassed the rushing paramedics who were carrying a dying child out the door. Instead, they raised their heavy weapons and aimed them directly at my chest. The lead officer shouted at me to put my hands in the air and dropped to my knees immediately. Terrence had not called them to help his own suffering son. My own brother had called the police to get rid of the only person who knew his dirty secret. I stared at the dark barrels of their weapons, feeling a terrifying mixture of betrayal and fierce determination. They thought they could silence me and sweep this abuse under the rug to protect their wealth and social status. They truly believed that the overly aggressive black woman would end up behind bars while they continued to play the perfect family on the internet. But they severely underestimated the profound love I had for my nephew and the relentless skills I possessed. As the cold metal handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists, I did not scream or fight back. I simply watched the ambulance speed away with Jamal and made a powerful silent vow to destroy every single hidden asset they owned. This was no longer just a family dispute over childcare. This was the beginning of an absolute war, and I was going to use every financial document I could find to bring their fraudulent empire crashing down to the cold, hard ground. The air inside the holding cell was frigid and smelled heavily of bleach and stale coffee. I sat on the hard metal bench, rubbing my wrists where the handcuffs had dug deep into my skin, leaving angry red welts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my sweet nephew lying on that concrete floor, gasping for air. I had no idea if Jamal had even survived the ambulance ride to the hospital because the police had confiscated my phone the moment they brought me into the precinct. I was completely isolated, waiting in the cold processing area while the officers typed up the ridiculous charges Ashley and Terrence had fabricated. I was facing breaking and entering, trespassing, and the completely fabricated animal cruelty charge because of the dog poison. Ashley's housekeeper had slipped into my purse. Hours dragged by in agonizing silence until the heavy steel door of the processing room buzzed loudly and swung open. I looked up expecting to see my public defender, but instead I saw my parents walking through the doorway. My mother Yvonne was draped in a tailored beige trench coat, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. My father Calvin trailed closely behind her, wearing his signature tailored golf slacks and an expression of profound irritation. They had just posted my bail. I stood up instantly, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over my tired body. I thought they had come to rescue me. I thought they had spoken to the doctors at the hospital and were rushing here to give me an update on Jamal. I took a step forward, ready to fall into my mother's arms and cry out the absolute terror I had been holding inside for the past 6 hours. But Yvonne did not reach out to hug me. She did not ask if I was physically okay or if the police had mistreated me. She did not even ask if Jamal was breathing. Instead, she stopped 2 feet away from me, her eyes narrowing with absolute disgust. "What is wrong with you, Jasmine?" She hissed, her voice tight and controlled so the desk sergeant across the room would not hear. "Have you completely lost your mind, going over to your brother's house and causing a massive scene like some street thug?" I stared at her in total disbelief. "Mom, I did not cause a scene," I whispered, my voice cracking with exhaustion. I found Jamal locked in a dark utility closet. He was starved to the bone and completely unresponsive. I had to do chest compressions to keep him alive until the paramedics arrived. Ashley and Terrence are starving him to death in that house. My father Calvin shifted his weight and let out a long, heavy sigh, crossing his arms over his chest. "Stop with these wild exaggerations, Jasmine," he muttered, shaking his head. "Terrence called us from the hospital. He said you broke into their home while they were out running errands and completely overreacted to a simple disciplinary measure. Jamal has always been a deeply troubled kid. You know, he throws these dramatic tantrums just to get attention. He probably locked himself in that closet to be spiteful." My jaw dropped. I could not believe the words coming out of my own father's mouth. "A simple disciplinary measure," I repeated, my voice rising in volume. "Dad, he looked like a skeleton. He was dying on that floor. He did not lock himself in there from the outside. Ashley is abusing him, and Terrence is letting it happen." Yvonne stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Keep your voice down," she commanded sharply. "I am not going to let your ridiculous jealousy ruin your brother's life. Terrence is literally 2 weeks away from becoming a senior partner at his investment firm. Do you have any idea how hard he has worked to reach that level of success?" As Black people in this city, we have to protect our successful men. We cannot afford to have a scandal like this attached to our family name. I stared at the woman who raised me, feeling a physical sickness taking root in my stomach. She was fully prepared to let her own grandson die in a dark closet just to protect her golden child's corporate promotion. Ashley comes from a very powerful family. Yvonne continued, her tone turning completely ruthless. Her father has immense political influence in this city. If you push this issue, they will crush you in court, Jasmine. They will make sure you lose your accounting license and you will end up in prison. When we go before the judge tomorrow morning, you are going to plead guilty to the trespassing charges. We have already spoken to a lawyer who can get you a plea deal for probation. You will apologize to Terrence and Ashley, and you will never mention this child abuse nonsense again. Do you understand me? You want me to plead guilty to crimes I did not commit to protect a woman who is trying to murder my best friend's son? I asked, tears of pure fury burning my eyes. My mother looked at me with cold calculation. She did not care about truth or justice. She only cared about her proximity to white wealth and elite social status. She viewed Ashley as a trophy that elevated our family standing, and she viewed Jamal as a convenient sacrifice to keep that trophy polished. I took a slow, deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left in my exhausted body. I am not pleading guilty to anything, I told them, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. And I am not going to stop until Terrence and Ashley are stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom. I am going to testify to exactly what I saw in that house, and I am going to make sure the entire city knows exactly who they really are. I pushed past my mother and walked toward the exit doors of the precinct, refusing to listen to another word of their toxic manipulation. I stepped out into the humid night air, but my mother rushed out right behind me, her heels clicking angrily on the concrete pavement. "You are making a massive mistake, Jasmine," she yelled, losing her carefully maintained composure. "You have no idea what you are messing with. Ashley and her family have done nothing but support that boy. Ashley's father is literally paying millions of dollars out of his own pocket every single year for Jamal's exclusive medical care." I stopped dead in my tracks right there on the precinct steps. The warm wind blew past my face as my mother's words echoed in the darkness. Millions of dollars for Jamal's exclusive medical care. My mind instantly shifted from that of a terrified aunt to the sharp analytical brain of a senior forensic accountant. I had just held that little boy in my arms. I was wearing filthy, ragged clothes and had not seen a doctor in months. His body was failing from severe starvation and absolute neglect. He had zero medical care. There were no private doctors visiting that mansion, and there were certainly no expensive treatments being administered. If Ashley's wealthy father was actively funneling millions of dollars into an account designated for Jamal's medical care, where exactly was all that money going? My tears dried up, instantly replaced by a sharp, chilling clarity. They had not just locked a child in a closet to hide him from their perfect social media life. They were using his existence to run a massive financial scam, and they were about to find out exactly why you never cross a forensic accountant who has nothing left to lose. The notification from my accounting firm arrived before the sun even came up the next morning. My senior partner sent a brief cold email stating that my employment was indefinitely suspended, pending the outcome of my criminal charges. They had already locked me out of the corporate servers and disabled my building keycard. My mother was right about one thing. Ashley and her family had wasted absolutely no time using their political connections to completely destroy my professional reputation. They wanted to strip away my resources so I would be too poor and too terrified to fight back against their false narrative. They expected me to cower in my apartment and beg for a plea deal just like my parents demanded. But suspending a senior forensic accountant only gives her exactly what she needs the most, which is uninterrupted free time to follow the money trail. I sat at my home office desk and cracked my knuckles, staring intently at my glowing dual monitors. I brewed a massive pot of strong black coffee and began pulling every single public tax document and property record tied to my brother and his flawless white wife. I did not need my corporate access to find the truth, because wealthy people who run financial scams always leave a digital paper trail if you know exactly where to look. I started my investigation with their magnificent suburban mansion. The public property deed painted a terrifying financial picture that completely shattered Terrence and his fake wealthy image. The house was not fully paid off like he constantly bragged at our arrogant family dinners. It was mortgaged to the absolute breaking point. I dug deeper into the county clerk records and found 3 separate hidden liens attached to the property by highly aggressive private creditors. Terrence was drowning in a dark ocean of toxic high-interest debt. I pulled up public regulatory filings for his prestigious investment banking firm and cross-referenced his recent corporate transaction history. My perfect golden child brother had not closed a single legitimate financial deal in over 3 years. His entire corporate career was nothing but smoke and mirrors designed to keep my parents blindly proud and his angry creditors temporarily satisfied. He was a complete fraud living on borrowed time. But the pure math of their daily life simply did not make any sense. If Terrence was completely broke and their massive house was on the verge of total foreclosure, how exactly was Ashley maintaining her wildly extravagant lifestyle? She posted pictures of rare designer bags, luxury tropical vacations, and imported sports cars every single week on her social media pages. I widened my search parameters and began tracing their active bank routing numbers through a series of complex data scraping algorithms I built myself during my early days as an auditor. It took me 6 grueling hours of relentless digging to break through the sophisticated layers of financial camouflage they had carefully constructed. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screens, but I refused to stop. I finally found the massive hidden artery keeping their fake glamorous empire alive. Millions of dollars were quietly flowing into their private joint checking accounts every single quarter like clockwork. The money was not coming from Ashley's rich political father, like my mother had so confidently claimed on the precinct steps. It was being systematically funneled into their personal accounts through a highly obscured shell company registered in the state of Delaware. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart pounding fiercely against my ribs as I isolated the corporate identification number of the shadowy shell company. Terrence and Ashley were draining this corporate entity completely dry. They were withdrawing hundreds of thousands of dollars each month to fund their luxurious public image while leaving my sweet innocent nephew to slowly starve in a dark, filthy utility closet. They were likely claiming the massive withdrawals were designated for Jamal's exclusive medical treatments, but my precise tracking showed the money going directly to private jet charters, high-end fashion boutiques, and aggressive debt collection agencies. I needed to know exactly who was funding this Delaware shell company. Wealthy politicians simply do not hide their personal money in anonymous corporate structures when paying for their grandchildren's necessary medical care. They use very public, highly visible charitable trust funds for maximum tax write-offs and positive public relations. This specific shell company was designed specifically to remain completely invisible from public scrutiny and government oversight. I ran the Delaware business entity through a highly restricted encrypted offshore database I previously used for tracking international corporate fraud. The complex system slowly decrypted the original incorporation documents, stripping away the fake dummy directors and the anonymous registered agents Terrence had clearly hired to conceal the ultimate truth. The blue progress bar on my screen inched forward, revealing the original founding signature line by line. I held my breath, gripping the edge of my desk, waiting for Ashley's powerful father's name to finally appear on the screen. When the final layer of heavy encryption dissolved, the name glowing brightly on my monitor hit me much harder than a physical blow to the chest. The Delaware Shell Company, holding all those millions of dollars, was not established by Ashley's wealthy family or my fraudulent investment banker brother. The founding legal documents were signed and fully executed 5 years ago by Alicia, my beautiful, brilliant best friend, and Jamal's late biological mother. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at her familiar signature on the glowing screen. Alicia had always been fiercely protective of her son, and somehow she had secretly amassed a massive fortune before her sudden tragic death. She had built an impenetrable financial fortress to ensure Jamal would be completely taken care of for the rest of his life. I grabbed my coffee mug, but my hands were shaking so violently that dark liquid spilled over the rim and splashed onto my desk. Alicia had trusted Terrence when she was alive, and he had repaid that sacred trust with unimaginable cruelty. The overwhelming rage I felt earlier at the police station was nothing compared to the absolute fury consuming my soul right now. I realized that Terrence and Ashley did not just want Jamal out of sight because he was a difficult child. They needed Jamal to disappear entirely so they could completely drain Alicia's secret fortune without raising any suspicion. If Jamal died from his severe neglect, they would easily inherit the entire shell company as his legal guardians and walk away as multimillionaires. I wiped the spilled coffee from my desk and began downloading every single document connecting Terrence to the stolen funds. The concrete walls of the underground parking garage felt damp and suffocating as I waited patiently in the thick shadows. I knew exactly what time Marcus left his corporate law firm every single evening. Marcus was the elite estate lawyer who handled all of Alicia's financial affairs before she passed away, and he was the man who helped Terrence and Ashley build their impenetrable fortress of lies. I stood completely still behind a massive cement pillar, clutching my heavy tote bag and watching the private elevator doors slide open. Marcus stepped out wearing a custom-tailored suit and carrying an expensive leather briefcase, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I watched his shiny sports car beep loudly as he unlocked it from across the dim garage. My sensible flat shoes made absolutely no sound on the cold cement as I stepped out from the darkness and firmly blocked his path to the driver's side door. Marcus jumped backward in pure shock and dropped his expensive briefcase onto the greasy floor. He let out a sharp, terrified gasp when he recognized my face under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lighting. I did not give him a single chance to run away or pull out his phone to call for private building security. I told him we needed to have a very serious private conversation about a specific shell company currently registered in Delaware, and that he was going to explain every corrupt detail to me before I let him leave this building tonight. Marcus puffed out his chest, trying desperately to regain his arrogant composure. He snatched his briefcase off the dirty floor and told me to get out of his way before he called the police to have me arrested for a second time. He sneered and said he heard all about my trespassing stunt at my brother's mansion. I stood my ground, completely blocking his access to the luxury vehicle. I asked him directly why a massive trust fund set up by my dead best friend was being systematically drained by Ashley and Terrence, while her only son withered away in a locked room. Marcus let out a cruel, condescending laugh that echoed against the concrete walls. He told me I was out of my depth and dealing with powerful people who could crush my existence like a tiny insect. He stated he could not tell me a single word about any financial documents or corporate structures because he was legally bound by a flawless non-disclosure agreement. He proudly revealed that Ashley's powerful political father had forced him to sign an ironclad contract years ago to protect the family wealth. Marcus warned me that if he breached that specific agreement, Ashley's father would personally ensure he lost his law license and faced total financial ruin. I took an aggressive step forward, attempting to physically intimidate me into moving aside so he could escape. He told me to go back to my apartment and accept my suspension from the accounting firm because this fight was already over. I did not move a single inch backward. I looked this corrupt lawyer dead in the eye and smiled a cold, calculated smile that made him freeze in his tracks. I told him he should be much more terrified of me right now than he was of Ashley's rich political father. I pulled a thick manila envelope from my tote bag and slapped it hard against the pristine hood of his expensive sports car. I calmly explained that I had spent the entire night digging deep into his personal offshore banking routing numbers and international wire transfers. I told him my custom forensic accounting software had successfully traced over $3 million in unreported income hiding in a highly classified secret account in the Cayman Islands. I watched the smug, arrogant smirk completely vanish from his pale face as I listed the exact dates and specific transfer amounts he had meticulously tried to hide from the federal government. I informed him that facilitating massive corporate tax fraud and actively participating in international money laundering carries a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence with absolutely no chance of early parole. I took a step closer, backing him directly against the driver's side door, and lowered my voice to a dangerous whisper. I gave him a very simple ultimatum right there in the empty parking garage. He could either tell me exactly what was hidden inside Alicia's corporate trust fund, or I would email my fully decrypted evidence file directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service before he finished his drive home tonight. Marcus began to sweat profusely under the bright garage lights, his confident exterior shattering into pieces. His hands shook violently as he realized I possessed the exact ammunition required to destroy his privileged life and lock him in a federal penitentiary for decades. He looked around the empty garage in pure panic, searching for an escape route that did not exist before unzipping his leather briefcase. He dug past layers of thick legal documents and pulled out a small black flash drive. He held it out to me with a trembling hand, like it was a live explosive device that might detonate. He whispered that everything I needed to know was fully encrypted on that tiny plastic drive. I snatched the drive from his sweaty palm and demanded he explain exactly what truth I was about to read. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously, as the sick truth finally spilled from his trembling mouth. He confessed that Alicia had left behind an irrevocable trust fund worth exactly $15 million specifically designated for Jamal. The fortune was meant to completely secure his future the second he turned 18. But Marcus revealed there was a highly specific and lethal legal clause buried deep inside the original trust documentation. If Jamal was officially deemed mentally unfit to manage his finances by a licensed medical professional, or if he tragically passed away before reaching his 18th birthday, the entire $15 million fortune would legally transfer directly to his surviving legal guardians. I felt a wave of absolute nausea crash over me as the horrific reality locked into place. Terrence and Ashley were not just hiding a difficult child in a dark utility closet because they favored their perfect public image. They were intentionally starving a little boy to death and driving him to the brink of absolute insanity so his body and mind would fail before his next birthday, guaranteeing them control over a $15 million fortune. Their lifestyle was funded by the methodical execution of my best friend's only child. The tires of my sedan screeched against the slick pavement of the Atlanta General Hospital parking garage. I did not bother straightening my car within the painted white lines. I grabbed my tote bag and sprinted toward the glowing emergency room entrance with my heart hammering violently against my ribs. The horrific truth Marcus had just revealed to me in that dark parking garage echoed relentlessly in my mind. $15 million. That was the exact price tag Terrence and Ashley had placed on my sweet nephew's innocent life. They were actively starving Jamal to trigger the lethal clause hidden deep inside Alicia's irrevocable corporate trust fund. If his organs failed before his 18th birthday, they would inherit absolute control over a massive financial empire without any legal oversight. I pushed through the heavy automatic glass doors of the hospital and completely ignored the triage desk where a line of people waited. I knew exactly where the pediatric intensive care unit was located because Alicia and I used to volunteer on that very floor during our college years. I bypassed the main public elevators, knowing they were far too slow, and took the concrete emergency stairwell, taking 2 steps at a time. My lungs burned with the physical exertion, but I absolutely could not stop moving. I had to reach Jamal's doctors immediately. I had to show them the decrypted financial documents, proving that his sudden organ failure was not a tragic medical mystery, but a highly calculated attempted murder executed by his own guardians. I burst through the heavy fire doors on the 4th floor, gasping for air, and marched directly toward the secure double doors of the pediatric intensive care wing. But my path was instantly blocked before I could even touch the handles. 2 massive hospital security guards stepped squarely in front of the restricted entrance, effectively forming a human wall of navy blue uniforms and radio equipment. I tried to sidestep them, but the taller guard held up his hand and sternly ordered me to halt. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a laminated color photograph. My stomach dropped into my shoes when I realized it was a printed picture of my face, taken from my corporate accounting firm profile. The guard looked at the photo and then glared down at me with cold, unwavering authority. He stated that I was legally prohibited from being anywhere on the hospital premises. He informed me that my brother and his wife had filed a permanent emergency restraining order against me earlier that very morning. They had legally weaponized my arrest from the previous day to completely block my physical access to Jamal. The police had documented my desperate attempt to save him as an aggressive, violent home invasion, making it incredibly easy for Ashley's high-priced corporate lawyers to secure the restraining order from a highly sympathetic judge. I pleaded with the security guards, my voice cracking with absolute desperation. I told them they were actively protecting child abusers and that my nephew was in critical danger right now in one of those hospital beds. The second guard rested his hand firmly on his utility belt and warned me that if I did not turn around and leave the property immediately, he would summon local law enforcement to drag me out in handcuffs again. I took a reluctant step backward, knowing that getting arrested a second time would leave Jamal completely defenseless against his predators. As I stood there trying to formulate a new strategy, a sudden flash of bright light caught my attention from down the sterile white hallway. Through the small rectangular glass window of the secure double doors, I could clearly see into the private waiting area of the intensive care unit. Ashley was standing right outside Jamal's recovery room, holding a professional circular ring light and her expensive smartphone mounted on a tripod. She was wearing perfectly pressed designer sweatpants and a pristine cashmere sweater purposely styled to make her look like a deeply exhausted but devoted mother holding vigil at the hospital. She had fresh, fake tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she spoke directly into her glowing phone camera. She was recording an emotional live broadcast for her hundreds of thousands of social media followers. Even through the thick glass, I could read her exaggerated facial expressions. She was undoubtedly spinning a tragic, heartbreaking story about her sweet, sick stepson fighting a mysterious, unexplainable illness. She was publicly harvesting massive amounts of sympathy and digital validation, while the little boy she deliberately starved lay dying just a few feet away. Terrence stood obediently in the background of her video frame, looking appropriately solemn and wiping his dry eyes on cue to play the role of the devastated black father. It was a perfectly choreographed theatrical performance designed to mask a brutal execution. Ashley was likely directing her gullible, wealthy followers to a fraudulent online donation page, further monetizing the horrific abuse they were inflicting on an innocent child. The sheer magnitude of their evil made a wave of profound nausea crash over my exhausted body. I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands until the skin nearly broke, fighting every instinct I had to shatter that glass door and tear that phone out of her perfectly manicured hands. I realized I could not win a physical fight against two armed security guards and a legally binding restraining order. I needed a completely different approach to break through their fortress. I slowly backed away from the restricted entrance and turned toward the visitor elevators, feigning total defeat. As I walked down the quiet corridor, a young black nurse wearing light blue surgical scrubs and a stethoscope draped around her neck emerged from a nearby supply closet. She was carrying a tall, heavy stack of thick medical charts. As she walked briskly past the security desk, she made brief but incredibly intense eye contact with me. I saw a flash of deep recognition and raw fear in her dark eyes. Before I could process her strange expression, she suddenly veered off her path and intentionally bumped her shoulder hard against mine. The heavy stack of medical folders slipped from her arms and crashed onto the polished linoleum floor, scattering confidential paperwork everywhere. I immediately dropped to my knees to help her gather the scattered medical records. The security guards remained at their post, simply watching us from a safe distance. As our hands brushed against each other on the floor, the nurse leaned in extremely close. Her face was perfectly hidden from the guard's line of sight. With lightning speed, she slipped a tiny, tightly folded piece of yellow notepad paper directly into the side pocket of my suit jacket. She did not say a single word to me. She just quickly scooped up the remaining folders, offered a loud, fake apology for her clumsiness, and hurried back down the hallway toward the intensive care unit. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I stood up and continued walking toward the elevator banks. I kept my hands perfectly still, holding my breath until the heavy metal elevator doors slid shut, enclosing me in complete privacy. My fingers shook uncontrollably as I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled yellow paper. I unfolded it under the harsh fluorescent light of the descending elevator car. The rushed handwritten message was scribbled in messy blue ink. The words on that tiny scrap of paper completely drained the blood from my face and sent a terrifying surge of cold adrenaline straight into my veins. The note read, "They just signed a do not resuscitate order, and the medical board approved it based on their false history. They are pulling his life support plug exactly at midnight tonight." The bright red digital numbers on my car dashboard glared relentlessly in the absolute dark, signaling that it was exactly 10 o'clock at night. I had precisely 2 hours left to completely invalidate the fraudulent medical directive before the hospital staff pulled the plug on my sweet nephew. The heavy dread sitting in my stomach was completely overshadowed by my hyper-focused determination to destroy their murderous plan. I drove my nondescript sedan around the perimeter and navigated toward the deserted rear loading dock of the massive hospital building. I knew I could not walk through the front doors or the emergency entrance because the armed security guards had my printed photograph and specific orders to arrest me on sight. I slipped past a massive delivery truck and entered the building through the unlocked service doors used by the overnight cafeteria staff. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I quietly navigated the labyrinth of concrete service corridors. I found exactly what I needed inside an unattended laundry staging area near the basement locker rooms. I quickly stripped off my expensive blazer and pulled a pair of baggy gray custodian scrubs directly over my clothes. I tied my hair back and grabbed a heavy yellow mop bucket and a spray bottle of strong bleach to complete my desperate disguise. I kept my head lowered and focused my eyes completely on the scuffed linoleum floor as I pushed the squeaking cart toward the staff elevators. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs when the elevator doors opened on the pediatric intensive care floor. The same two imposing security guards were still stationed directly outside the restricted patient wing. I gripped the plastic handle of my mop tightly and pushed my cleaning cart straight down the adjacent administrative hallway, completely bypassing their direct line of sight. I sprayed the walls with strong chemicals and wiped down the dusty baseboards, pretending to be entirely absorbed in my menial late-night cleaning duties until the armed guards finally turned their diverted attention back to their glowing mobile phones. I abandoned the yellow bucket outside the dark administrative office and quietly slipped my stolen master keycard out of my pocket. I had swiped the plastic card from an empty nurse's station on my way up the stairs. The heavy wooden door to the physical medical records room clicked open with a quiet mechanical hum, and I slipped seamlessly inside the pitch-black restricted space. I turned on the small flashlight application on my mobile phone and directed the narrow beam of light across the massive rows of color-coded filing cabinets. The room smelled like old paper and strong antiseptic. I moved quickly down the aisles, searching for the specific alphabetical section holding the current intensive care patient files. My fingers trembled slightly as I finally pulled Jamal's thick medical chart from the metal shelf and laid it flat on a wooden reading desk. I flipped past the fabricated intake forms and the exaggerated nursing notes dictated by Ashley until I found the official legal document I desperately needed to find. The Do Not Resuscitate order was printed on bright pink paper, signaling its critical medical urgency. I shined my light directly onto the authorizing physician's signature line at the very bottom of the page. The messy blue ink spelled out the name, Dr. William Montgomery. My forensic accounting brain instantly recognized that specific wealthy surname from the extensive background research I had conducted on Ashley's powerful political family. I pulled up my encrypted database on my phone and quickly cross-referenced the medical license number with public family heritage records. The results loading on my screen confirmed my absolute worst fears. Dr. William Montgomery was not an impartial medical professional assigned by the hospital board to save a dying innocent child. He was Ashley's biological uncle. This was an unprecedented conflict of interest and an egregious act of criminal medical malpractice. Ashley's uncle had deliberately signed a fraudulent death warrant for his own niece's stepson just to help them secure the $15 million offshore trust fund before the midnight deadline. I immediately activated the high-resolution scanner application on my phone and began photographing every single page of the extensive medical file. I made sure the artificial lighting perfectly captured the fraudulent doctor signatures and the completely fabricated nutritional deficit reports that Ashley had maliciously provided. This fully encrypted digital copy was the only tangible proof I possessed to completely invalidate the lethal medical directive and ultimately save my helpless nephew from a highly calculated corporate execution. I secured the digital files behind a heavy encryption firewall on my mobile device and slipped the phone deep into the pocket of my baggy gray scrubs. I carefully placed the physical medical chart back into its exact location on the metal shelf, ensuring I left absolutely no trace of my unauthorized presence in the records room. I took a deep breath to steady my racing pulse and pushed the heavy wooden door open to step back out into the dimly lit administrative corridor. A large, incredibly powerful hand suddenly shot out from the dark administrative alcove and grabbed my upper arm with terrifying physical violence. I was brutally shoved backward against the hard plaster wall before I could even attempt to scream or fight back. The heavy yellow mop bucket was kicked aside loudly as my attacker pinned me firmly in place. I looked up into the furious, bloodshot eyes of my own brother. Terrence had easily recognized my face despite the baggy custodian uniform and my lowered head. He pressed his thick forearm heavily against my fragile collarbone, completely cutting off my physical ability to call for immediate help from the nearby hospital security guards. He leaned in incredibly close until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the nervous sweat radiating from his expensive designer suit. He did not yell or cause a public scene because he knew preserving his flawless corporate image was the most important thing in his miserable life. Instead, he lowered his voice to a chilling, dangerous whisper that echoed menacingly in the empty hallway. He told me with pure venom in his voice that I had absolutely no idea what kind of powerful political monsters I was currently trying to fight in this city. He stated that Ashley's wealthy father literally owned every single local judge and prosecuting attorney in the entire metropolitan city. Terrence aggressively tightened his painful physical grip on my deeply bruised arm and firmly warned me that if I did not turn around and walk away from this hospital, immediately letting Jamal die quietly at the stroke of midnight, I would easily spend the absolute rest of my natural life rotting away inside a maximum security federal prison cell. The heavy iron gates of my brother's sprawling suburban estate slowly swung open, revealing the pristine manicured lawns and the perfectly paved circular driveway. I parked my nondescript sedan near the massive stone fountain, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart before stepping out into the humid morning air. I needed to execute the performance of a lifetime today. I forced my shoulders to slump forward and intentionally made my hands tremble as I walked up the wide brick steps toward the imposing double mahogany doors. Terrence yanked the front door open before I could even reach the brass knocker. He wore a crisp, tailored suit and a look of absolute arrogant triumph on his face. He grabbed my upper arm roughly and pulled me inside the sterile, echoing foyer, checking the driveway to ensure I had come completely alone. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor, playing the role of the terrified, defeated sister who had finally been crushed by his immense political power. Terrence led me through the echoing hallway and into the massive formal living room where his wife was waiting to hold court. Ashley sat elegantly on a pristine white velvet sofa, wearing a silk designer robe and sipping a dark espresso from a delicate porcelain cup. A professional lighting rig and a tripod were set up in the corner of the room, ready for her next fake sympathetic social media broadcast. Ashley took a slow sip of her coffee and let out a soft, condescending laugh as she looked down at my inexpensive clothing and my intentionally messy hair. She told me she knew I would eventually come to my senses and realize that a low-level numbers cruncher could never defeat a family with unlimited wealth and political connections. I kept my head lowered and wrapped my arms around my stomach, pretending to shake with raw fear. I told them, my voice intentionally cracking, that I did not want to spend the rest of my natural life rotting in a federal prison cell. I begged them to just let me walk away from this entire nightmare and promised I would never speak a single word about Jamal or the hospital records to anyone ever again. Terrence smiled a sickeningly proud smile and walked over to a massive glass coffee table. He picked up a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper and dropped them carelessly onto the glass surface. He informed me that walking away was not going to be that simple because they needed an absolute guarantee that my overly aggressive tendencies were permanently neutralized. Ashley gracefully stood up from the velvet sofa and walked toward a sleek wooden writing desk in the corner of the expansive room. She pulled a long, narrow checkbook from a leather drawer and picked up an expensive gold fountain pen. She told me they were willing to offer a highly generous settlement to ensure my complete and total silence regarding her stepson's unfortunate medical decline. Ashley slowly wrote out a check and walked back to the glass table, dropping the small slip of paper directly on top of the legal documents. She proudly announced that the check was written for exactly $1 million. She sneered and stated that it was a massive fortune a pathetic working-class accountant like me could never hope to earn in a single lifetime. I stared down at the crisp paper, feeling a violent wave of disgust wash over my entire body. I looked up at Ashley, allowing a few fake tears to spill down my cheeks, and asked her why she was doing this to a helpless, innocent little boy. I pleaded with her to understand that Jamal was just a child who desperately needed real medical care and a loving family. Ashley rolled her eyes in profound annoyance and let out a sharp, disgusted sigh. She crossed her arms over her silk robe and completely dropped her carefully curated sympathetic mother persona. She coldly stated that Jamal was always a complete lost cause who never fit into her flawless luxury lifestyle brand. She told me with absolute venom in her voice that the boy was born with terrible genetics inherited directly from his ghetto mother. She openly called Alicia a piece of urban trash and claimed her son was exactly the same kind of worthless burden on society. I felt my fingernails dig violently into the palms of my hands as I listened to her disgusting racist microaggressions. Terrence stood right beside his racist white wife, completely silent and perfectly willing to let her insult his dead black wife and his dying black son just to maintain his proximity to her family wealth. Ashley confidently continued her horrific monologue, completely unaware that she was digging her own grave. She proudly confessed that the $15 million trust fund was being entirely wasted on a defective child. She admitted that she desperately needed that massive fortune to expand her luxury influencer empire and launch her new high-end wellness brand. She stated that faking his medical decline and starving him to death was simply a necessary business transaction to liberate the funds from Alicia's restrictive legal control. She told me to take the $1 million, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and consider myself lucky. They were paying me off instead of having my body buried in a shallow ditch. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the gold fountain pen from the glass table. I let out a loud, dramatic sob, playing the broken, defeated victim one final time. I pressed the expensive pen to the heavy paper and signed my full legal name on the signature line of the massive non-disclosure agreement. I picked up the $1 million check and slipped it quietly into my plain leather tote bag. Terrence snatched the signed legal documents from the table, checking my signature before letting out a loud sigh of pure, arrogant relief. He ordered me to get out of his mansion and warned me that if he ever saw my face near his property or his hospital room again, he would call his father's powerful judges and have me locked away forever. I turned around without saying another word and walked slowly across the polished marble foyer, pushing the heavy mahogany doors open and stepping back out into the bright, humid morning air. I walked down the brick steps and got directly into the driver's seat of my nondescript sedan. The second the heavy car door slammed shut, enclosing me in complete privacy, my entire demeanor instantly shifted. The fake tears dried up completely, and the trembling in my hands immediately stopped. I reached up and gently tapped the beautiful silver pendant hanging from the silver chain around my neck. The elegant jewelry was actually a high-tech military-grade recording device I had purchased through my private security contacts. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile as I confirmed the tiny flashing green light on the back of the pendant. I had just recorded every single horrific racist confession and every detail of their premeditated murder plot in crystal clear high-definition audio. I put the car in drive and sped down the long driveway, leaving their fake empire behind, knowing I now held the exact weapon required to obliterate their entire existence. The bright red digital numbers on my car dashboard glared relentlessly as I aggressively maneuvered my nondescript sedan through the heavy morning traffic, heading straight toward the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Atlanta. Every single passing second felt like a crushing weight against my chest as I slammed my foot heavily onto the accelerator, weaving dangerously between slow-moving delivery trucks and oblivious commuters. My right hand remained firmly pressed against the silver pendant resting on my collarbone, fiercely protecting the high-definition audio, recording that held the absolute power to completely destroy my corrupt family. I did not even bother searching for a designated visitor parking space when I finally reached the imposing concrete federal building. I carelessly abandoned my vehicle directly near the security barriers and sprinted frantically towards the heavy revolving glass doors, completely ignoring the loud, aggressive protests of the armed perimeter guards. I knew exactly who I desperately needed to see inside this sterile, intimidating fortress. Agent David Vance was a senior investigator in the Financial Crimes Division and the only federal officer who had ever taken my previous frantic concerns about my brother's sudden unexplainable wealth seriously. I aggressively pushed my way past the crowded, chaotic reception area and slammed both of my palms flat against the thick, bulletproof glass separating me from the secure inner checkpoint. I breathlessly demanded that the startled receptionist call Agent Vance, immediately stating loudly that I possessed irrefutable recorded audio evidence of a massive ongoing corporate fraud and a highly calculated, premeditated attempted murder. Agent Vance hurried into the sterile, windowless interrogation room exactly 10 minutes later, looking deeply exhausted and carrying a thick manila folder securely under his arm. He firmly locked the heavy metal door behind him and sat down heavily across from me at the scratched aluminum table. I did not waste a single breath on formal pleasantries or polite introductions. I simply reached up to my trembling neck, unclasped the silver pendant, placed it precisely in the dead center of the table, and activated the digital playback function. The pristine audio quality instantly filled the quiet, suffocating room, perfectly amplifying Ashley's cold, racist voice and her explicit, disgusting confession about intentionally starving an innocent little boy to secure absolute control over a $15 million offshore trust fund. I watched Agent Vance's tired eyes widen in absolute shock as the horrific reality of their calculated execution plan echoed loudly against the bare concrete walls. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles physically jumped, as Terrence's panicked voice joined the digital recording, confirming the $1 million bribe offering and their absolute arrogant certainty that local judges were already heavily paid off to look the other way. When the audio file finally clicked into a dead, chilling silence, a heavy, suffocating dread completely consumed the small interrogation room. I stared intensely at the veteran federal agent, fully expecting him to immediately grab his radio and violently dispatch a heavily armed tactical SWAT team to the pediatric intensive care unit to save my dying nephew. Instead of taking immediate, decisive action, Agent Vance slowly dragged his rough hands across his pale, sweating face and let out a deeply frustrated sigh that made the warm blood run entirely cold in my veins. He leaned his heavy forward, resting his elbows on the aluminum table, and quietly explained that the secret recording was incredibly damning, but it was completely legally insufficient for securing an instant emergency raid warrant tonight. He stated in a grim, serious tone that since I had secretly recorded a private legal negotiation while actively pretending to sign a binding non-disclosure agreement, any competent high-priced defense attorney funded by Ashley's powerful father would easily tie the audio evidence up in endless appellate court hearings for months, citing fruit of the poisonous tree. The corrupt local medical board had already officially authorized the do not resuscitate order based solely on a licensed physician's completely fabricated medical history and highly falsified nutritional deficit reports. Agent Vance warned me with grim, absolute certainty that the Federal Bureau of Investigation could not simply storm a local city hospital and violently override a standing legal medical directive without concrete, undeniable physical proof of the massive financial conspiracy driving the attempted murder. He explained thoroughly that Ashley's political father had deeply embedded his corrupt, dirty influence into every single layer of the local judicial system, meaning a single illegally recorded conversation would never convince a cautious federal judge to intervene before the fast-approaching midnight deadline. We desperately needed the actual physical offshore account ledgers, proving the exact routing numbers and the specific massive financial transfers between the shadow shell company and the corrupt medical board members. My analytical forensic mind raced frantically as I processed this devastating, insurmountable legal roadblock while the digital clock on the wall ticked mercilessly toward my sweet nephew's impending midnight execution. I forcefully slammed my fist against the cold metal table, angrily demanding to know how we could possibly retrieve those specific financial ledgers in time to stop the hospital staff from pulling the life support plug. Agent Vance opened his worn manila folder and slowly slid a series of grainy surveillance photographs across the scratched aluminum surface. The glossy pictures clearly showed Ashley's wealthy, arrogant father transferring a heavy locked steel briefcase from his private armored vehicle into the heavily guarded, restricted penthouse suite of the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown. Agent Vance explained that his federal financial division had been actively tracking the massive offshore money laundering ring for several long months, but his advanced cyber team could never get past the extreme military-grade encryption protecting the digital offshore ledgers. Ashley's cautious father kept the only physical printed copies of the routing numbers securely locked inside a highly advanced biometric safe located directly inside his temporary hotel office. The terrifying, crushing reality of the desperate situation washed over my exhausted, trembling body as I stared down at the surveillance photos. The Grand Plaza Hotel was the exact highly publicized location where Ashley was currently hosting her massive annual high society winter charity gala this very evening. My corrupt family was actively using the lavish public charitable event as a glamorous, untouchable front to physically launder the stolen trust fund money through fake anonymous donations, while my innocent nephew drew his final shallow breaths across town in a dark, sterile hospital room. I stared intensely at the digital clock mounted high on the sterile interrogation room wall, feeling the remaining warmth drain completely out of my pale face. The glowing red numbers indicated it was exactly 11 o'clock at night. I had exactly 60 agonizing minutes left to completely invalidate the lethal do not resuscitate order before the corrupt hospital staff permanently ended an innocent little boy's life. Agent Vance sternly warned me that the Winter Charity Gala was an elite, highly exclusive invite-only event, heavily guarded by private armed security contractors who were explicitly instructed to keep me out of the luxury building at all absolute costs. Ashley had already maliciously plastered my face across the local evening news broadcasts, publicly branding me as an unstable, violent criminal threat to her perfect, wealthy family. I was officially considered public enemy number one in this sprawling metropolitan city, and every single security guard patrolling the perimeter of that glowing luxury hotel would immediately recognize my face on sight. But I also knew deep in my soul that if I did not somehow break into that heavily guarded penthouse suite and physically extract those ledgers from the biometric safe before the stroke of midnight, Jamal would absolutely never open his beautiful eyes again. I snatched the surveillance photos off the cold metal table and turned my back on the federal agent without saying another single word. My family arrogantly believed they had perfectly secured their murderous fortune behind high society walls and paid-off politicians. They had completely underestimated the extreme dangerous lengths a desperate forensic accountant would go to when balancing the ultimate ledger. I had exactly 1 hour to infiltrate the most exclusive gala in the entire city, shatter their glamorous, untouchable illusion, and retrieve the only physical evidence that could stop a murder. The heavy polished brass door handle of the restricted penthouse suite felt ice cold against my trembling palm as I stood silently in the lavish upper hallway of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The distant thumping bass from the exclusive Winter Charity Gala, raging several floors below, provided the perfect acoustic cover for my desperate infiltration. I wore a crisp white button-down shirt and a tight black vest, having successfully stolen a catering uniform from an unattended laundry cart near the service elevators. I took a deep, stabilizing breath and reached deep into the front pocket of my uniform, pulling out a tiny transparent strip of advanced medical silicone. My forensic background had taught me how to preserve digital evidence, but sheer desperation had taught me how to lift a perfect biometric fingerprint. Earlier that morning, when Ashley arrogantly forced me to sign that disgusting non-disclosure agreement inside her sprawling mansion, she had carelessly pressed her index finger firmly against the smooth barrel of the gold fountain pen. I had carefully extracted her fingerprint using the silicone strip. The absolute second I returned to the privacy of my vehicle, I gently pressed the sticky transparent strip directly onto my own right index finger, carefully smoothing out any microscopic air bubbles to ensure the cloned ridges aligned flawlessly. I swiped the stolen catering master keycard over the electronic lock and pushed the heavy wooden doors open, slipping silently into the pitch-black executive office. The massive room smelled strongly of expensive leather-aged Cuban cigars and raw political arrogance. I completely ignored the lavish antique furniture and the breathtaking panoramic view of the glowing Atlanta skyline, moving directly toward the massive oil painting hanging conspicuously behind the main mahogany desk. I swung the heavy-framed painting outward, revealing the sleek, glowing interface of a highly advanced biometric wall safe. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I pressed my silicone-covered finger firmly against the glowing green scanner plate. The machine processed the fake biometric data for 3 agonizing seconds before a quiet electronic chime echoed through the dark room, followed by the heavy metallic clank of thick steel locking bolts sliding smoothly out of place. I pulled the heavy steel door open and immediately reached inside, grabbing the sleek digital hard drive resting on the top velvet shelf. I quickly connected my heavily encrypted mobile device directly to the physical drive, bypassing their external security firewalls entirely. The bright blue download progress bar appeared on my glowing phone screen, slowly creeping forward as the massive cache of offshore financial ledgers began transferring into my possession. I stared intensely at the numbers, watching the encrypted files clone themselves, knowing this was the exact physical proof agent Vance desperately needed to authorize the emergency hospital raid. Suddenly, the heavy metallic click of the outer penthouse door handle turning shattered the quiet silence of the room. A bright sliver of harsh hallway light spilled across the plush carpet. I snatched my mobile device, disconnecting the cable in a sheer panic, and violently threw my entire body underneath the massive mahogany executive desk, just seconds before the heavy double doors swung completely open. Bright overhead lights instantly flooded the lavish office, illuminating the dark floor where I lay completely paralyzed with terror. Heavy, expensive leather shoes walked aggressively across the carpet, stopping mere inches from my trembling face. I instantly recognized the loud, booming, arrogant voice of Ashley's powerful political father echoing through the room. He was speaking to an older man whose voice shook with obvious nervous tension, whom he repeatedly addressed as Senator. I pressed both of my hands brutally hard against my mouth, completely terrified that the sound of my violently hammering heart would expose my hidden location. I held my breath until my lungs burned as the 2 powerful men casually opened the liquor cabinet directly above my head and poured themselves thick glasses of expensive scotch. They immediately began discussing the illegal offshore accounts in chilling, explicit detail, completely unaware that the forensic accountant they were actively trying to destroy was listening to every single word. Ashley's father took a slow sip of his drink and confidently assured the nervous senator that every single one of their massive mounting campaign debts would be completely wiped clean by tomorrow morning. He let out a cold, ruthless laugh and explicitly stated that once his worthless step-grandson finally expired before the impending midnight deadline, the restrictive legal seals on the $15 million trust fund would be fully unlocked. He proudly promised the corrupt politician that the massive fortune would be immediate to their untraceable shadow accounts to cover all their illegal political bribes. They were casually discussing the premeditated murder of my sweet, innocent nephew, as if it were nothing more than a highly profitable corporate merger. The 2 wealthy monsters clinked their heavy crystal glasses together in a sickening toast to their own impending wealth, and finally turned around to leave the executive office to return to the glamorous charity gala downstairs. The heavy wooden doors clicked firmly shut, plunging the lavish room back into absolute darkness. I slowly dragged my violently shaking body out from underneath the mahogany desk and leaned heavily against the wall, gasping quietly for air. I looked down at my glowing mobile device, confirming that the massive file download was 100% complete. I quickly opened the decrypted offshore ledgers, searching frantically for the specific routing numbers the Federal Bureau of Investigation required to freeze the lethal medical directive. My eyes darted rapidly across the detailed financial columns and complex banking spreadsheets, using my years of forensic accounting experience to instantly analyze the massive flow of illicit capital. As I scrolled deeper into the hidden corporate files, the horrifying ultimate twist of their massive conspiracy suddenly revealed itself on my small glowing screen, making the blood run completely cold in my veins. The heavily guarded ledgers did not just show a family trying to steal extra money out of pure corporate greed. The spreadsheets clearly showed decades of catastrophic failed business investments, massive real estate foreclosures, and absolutely crushing legal debts tied directly to Ashley's father. Her supposedly untouchable, powerful political family was completely bankrupt. They did not possess a single dime of their own actual money, and their entire flawless luxury lifestyle brand was nothing but a fragile house of cards. The digital ledgers proved undeniably that for the past 7 years, they had been secretly surviving entirely on the money illegally siphoned from a helpless dying black child's corporate trust fund. They needed Jamal to die tonight, not to get richer, but because his death was the only thing preventing their entire fake empire from collapsing into absolute catastrophic ruin. I crouched in the dark hotel hallway, staring intensely at the glowing blue progress bar on my encrypted mobile device. Every single percentage point felt like an absolute eternity, as the massive cache of offshore financial ledgers successfully transferred directly to Agent Vance's secure federal server. The digital files contained the absolute undeniable physical proof of their catastrophic financial bankruptcy and their highly calculated plot to murder my innocent nephew just to cover their massive mounting debts. The screen finally flashed a bright green confirmation signaling the data transfer was 100% complete. A few seconds later, a secure text message appeared from Agent Vance simply stating, "We have the ledgers, the warrant is signed, and tactical teams are moving on the hospital right now." I let out a shaky breath, feeling a massive crushing weight physically lift off my exhausted shoulders. The digital files were finally out of my hands and safely in federal custody, meaning the corrupt local judges could no longer protect Ashley's desperate family. Jamal was going to survive the night. I quickly stripped off the stolen catering vest and the oversized white button-down shirt, leaving them in a crumpled pile on the carpet. I smoothed out the elegant dark evening gown I had deliberately worn underneath my disguise, taking a moment to steady my racing pulse. I ran my fingers through my messy hair, fixing it as best as I could, and marched purposefully toward the grand ballroom doors. The heavy thumping bass of the live orchestra washed over me as I pushed the heavy double doors open and stepped boldly into the blinding lights of the Winter Charity Gala. The massive ballroom was a disgusting display of extreme stolen opulence. Towering ice sculptures, carved into the shapes of angels, melted slowly onto silk tablecloths, while waiters carried silver trays loaded with expensive caviar and crystal flutes of imported champagne. The room was packed to the absolute brim with 500 of the wealthiest elite socialites in the entire metropolitan city, all completely unaware that this glamorous, untouchable event was entirely funded by blood money stolen from a dying little boy. I navigated slowly through the sea of designer suits and expensive silk dresses, moving closer and closer to the glowing main stage. Exactly. At that moment, my brother Terrence stepped confidently up to the crystal podium, tapping the microphone to demand absolute silence from the wealthy crowd. His arrogant, booming voice echoed through the massive room, thanking his powerful guests for their generous donations to his fake charitable foundation. He then seamlessly shifted his tone, adopting a sickeningly fake, sympathetic persona to discuss his nephew's tragic medical decline. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye while the wealthy audience murmured in collective sympathy, actively laundering more of their dirty money right in front of my eyes. Terrence gripped the edges of the podium and announced with a loud dramatic sigh that his deeply troubled sister had finally come to her senses. He told the crowd that I had been suffering from severe emotional instability due to the grief of Jamal's illness. But I was here tonight to publicly apologize to the entire family for my recent erratic behavior. The blinding stage spotlight suddenly swung directly onto my face, violently illuminating me in the exact middle of the crowded ballroom. My mother, Yvonne, and my father, Calvin, were standing rigidly near the front of the stage holding expensive drinks. They locked eyes with me and aggressively mouthed the words, "Do not mess this up." Their faces twisted in an absolute dark warning. They cared infinitely more about preserving their flawless social image and maintaining their proximity to Ashley's supposed wealth than they ever did about my life or their own grandson's survival. Ashley sat incredibly comfortably in the front row VIP section wearing a custom diamond necklace that was literally paid for by my nephew's stolen trust fund. She offered me a cold, arrogant smirk, swirling her champagne glass, as if she had definitively won the ultimate war against a pathetic working-class accountant. The armed private security guards shifted nervously near the exits, fully prepared to drag me out. But they did not intervene because Terrence had explicitly invited me up to the stage. I walked slowly up the carpeted stairs, my high heels clicking softly but firmly against the wooden floorboards. Every single eye in the massive ballroom was locked directly onto me, expecting a broken, defeated woman begging for mercy. Terrence grabbed my upper arm roughly as I reached the podium, his fingernails digging painfully into my bruised skin. He forced a thick folded piece of heavy premium paper into my trembling hands. It was a meticulously prepared, humiliating apology script, completely fabricating my mental instability and legally absolving them of any medical negligence or financial wrongdoings. The text forced me to admit to wild paranoid delusions and explicitly stated that Dr. William Montgomery was providing perfect palliative care. He leaned in incredibly close, his expensive heavy cologne suffocating me, and whispered a harsh, violent threat directly into my ear. He demanded that I read every single word exactly as written, apologizing to his wife and his family, or the corrupt local judges his father owned would have me arrested and thrown into federal prison before I even reached the hotel parking lot. He released my arm and took a deliberate step back, crossing his arms and waiting for my complete public surrender. I stood completely alone behind the glowing crystal podium, staring out at the sea of 500 expectant faces and the flashing lenses of the local media cameras gathered in the very back of the room. I looked down at the humiliating script, filled with disgusting, legally binding lies designed to perfectly protect a family of literal monsters. I looked at my parents who were glaring at me with pure, silent pressure, demanding my total submission, just like they had done my entire life. I looked at Ashley smirking in the front row, fully believing her bankrupt, fragile empire was completely untouchable. And finally, I looked at Terrence standing smugly to my left, waiting for me to destroy my own credibility to save his miserable life. My hands stopped trembling entirely. My analytical forensic accountant brain was no longer operating on fear or panic, but on pure, cold, absolute justice. I gripped the thick edges of the prepared apology script and deliberately ripped the heavy paper directly in half, tearing it again and again until it was entirely destroyed. I let the shredded pieces flutter carelessly down to the polished stage floor like cheap confetti. A collective sharp gasp echoed through the massive ballroom as my parents' faces completely drained of all their color. Ashley's arrogant smirk instantly vanished, turning into a look of absolute sheer panic. Terrence uncrossed his arms, taking a hesitant, confused step forward. I leaned comfortably into the microphone, smiling a bright, genuine, confident smile directly into the flashing media cameras. "I am so sorry," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear and incredibly powerful through the absolute dead silence of the room. "I am sorry it took me this long to audit you." The absolute dead silence in the massive ballroom hung heavily in the air for a fraction of a second before I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I did not break eye contact with the flashing media cameras as my thumb pressed firmly down on the executing command button. Instantly, the towering projector screens mounted directly behind the crystal podium flickered violently. The logo of Terrence's charitable foundation completely vanished, plunging the glowing stage into brief, confusing darkness before a bright light illuminated the entire lavish room. The massive screens did not display the humiliating apology script they had violently forced upon me. Instead, they broadcasted the raw, undeniable truth in crystal clear high definition. On the far left screen, the live offshore bank ledgers actively scrolled downward, showing the exact routing numbers, moving massive amounts of stolen capital from my sweet nephew's trust fund directly into Ashley's completely bankrupt family accounts. The center screen boldly displayed the bright pink fake "Do Not Resuscitate" order complete with the forged medical signatures, explicitly authorizing the execution of a helpless child before midnight. But it was the towering right screen that finally shattered the wealthy crowd's polite, sophisticated composure. High-resolution photographs flashed consecutively, showing my sweet, innocent nephew Jamal locked away in a dark, filthy closet, his tiny, fragile body completely emaciated from endless months of intentional starvation. A collective, horrifying scream ripped through the sea of 500 elite guests as the graphic, devastating images of the starving child burned deeply into their minds. The elegant crystal champagne flutes shattered loudly against the polished wooden floorboards as wealthy socialites recoiled in absolute visceral disgust, dropping their appetizers onto the silk tablecloths. The pristine, glamorous illusion of the winter charity gala was instantly obliterated, replaced by the chaotic, frantic reality of a massive active crime scene. Terrence realized his entire fraudulent existence was collapsing in real time, right in front of his wealthy donors. His handsome face contorted into a dark mask of pure, unhinged rage, and he charged aggressively across the carpeted stage toward the crystal podium. He lunged violently, aiming his heavy, shaking hands directly at the microphone stand, desperately trying to physically cut off the audio feed and silence my voice forever. My specialized forensic training had taught me exactly how to anticipate panicked, desperate reactions from cornered criminals. I swiftly sidestepped his aggressive tackle, easily dodging his heavy frame. Terrence lost his balance, entirely crashing incredibly hard into the heavy wooden speaker monitors with a sickening thud that echoed through the room. I yanked the microphone cleanly off its metal stand, clutching it tightly in my hand as I stepped forward to the very edge of the glowing stage, completely unprotected but absolutely fearless. I projected my booming, confident voice directly into the microphone, ensuring every single syllable echoed flawlessly over the chaotic screams of the panicked crowd. I demanded that they look closely at the financial ledgers actively scrolling on the massive screens behind me. I methodically narrated their horrific crimes line by line, exposing the complex, premeditated murder plot masquerading as a high society charitable foundation. I pointed directly at Ashley, who was violently shaking in the front row VIP section. I forced the entire wealthy audience to understand the disgusting racial and financial reality of their massive conspiracy. I explicitly detailed how this supposedly powerful elite white family was completely and utterly bankrupt, entirely devoid of their own actual wealth. I exposed exactly how they had spent the last 7 years, parasitically leeching off the massive financial empire built from the ground up by my deceased black sister-in-law, Alicia. I explained with absolute cold precision that Ashley and her corrupt political father were actively starving a beautiful black child to death tonight, solely to maintain their fake luxury lifestyle brand and cover their crushing legal debts. I told the horrified crowd that the imported caviar they were eating and the vintage champagne they were currently drinking were literally paid for by the intentional suffering of an innocent boy who was currently taking his final shallow breaths in a dark, sterile hospital room across town. The media cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every single word of my damning vocal audit while the undeniable proof glowed brightly on the towering screens behind my back. Ashley finally snapped under the crushing weight of the absolute truth. She violently shoved her way out of her plush velvet chair, completely dropping her carefully curated, elegant persona. Her designer evening gown twisted around her ankles as she stumbled frantically forward, her face bright red and distorted with sheer panic. She pointed a violently trembling finger at the glowing projector screens and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked wildly into the echoing ballroom, desperately claiming that the financial ledgers were completely fabricated and that the horrifying photos of the starving child were nothing but fake news designed by a jealous, mentally unstable relative. She frantically grabbed the shoulders of the wealthy donors sitting near her, loudly begging them not to believe the digital evidence and promising that her powerful political father would sue me for massive defamation. Her shrill, desperate screams echoed pathetically against the melting, towering ice sculptures, exposing the absolute fragility of her fake, untouchable empire. My parents, Yvonne and Calvin, stood completely frozen in terror near the front of the stage, watching their only source of proximity to wealth and power evaporate into thin air. The private armed security guards finally began advancing toward the glowing stage, their hands reaching for their heavy tactical belts, but they were far too late to stop the momentum of justice. The federal warrant was already executed at the hospital, and my final digital command had just been fully processed by the network. Exactly at that moment, every single mobile device inside the massive crowded ballroom simultaneously chimed with a loud, identical digital alert. 500 elite socialites, wealthy donors, and local investigative journalists simultaneously looked down at their glowing phone screens. An anonymous mass airdrop notification had just successfully delivered a massive encrypted file directly to every single person in the room. The chaotic screaming abruptly stopped as they all stared in absolute shocked silence at the incoming data transfer. The file opening on their screens was the full 100-page digital dossier containing every single piece of undeniable forensic evidence: the bank statements, the forged medical records, and the full audio recording of Ashley's racist murder confession, proving beyond any doubt that their glamorous world was built entirely on the blood of a child. The massive projector screens continued to cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across the luxurious ballroom, illuminating the absolute terror spreading like a virus through the wealthy crowd. My words hung in the suffocating air as the digital dossier finished downloading onto 500 glowing mobile devices. Ashley's father suddenly erupted from the VIP section, his face contorted into a terrifying mask of purple rage. The fake polished political charm he had spent decades carefully cultivating completely vanished, replaced by the desperate, violent panic of a cornered animal. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at the stage and roared at the top of his lungs, ordering his private armed security contractors to immediately arrest me for corporate espionage and digital terrorism. He screamed wildly that I had illegally hacked into his secure private hotel suite and stolen highly classified financial documents belonging to a sitting state senator. The heavy tactical boots of the private security guards thudded loudly against the polished hardwood floor as they immediately drew their batons and advanced aggressively toward the glowing stage. My parents Yvonne and Calvin frantically scrambled backward, knocking over a crystal champagne tower in their desperate, cowardly attempt to distance themselves from me before the violent arrest. Terrence was still breathing heavily, leaning against the shattered speaker monitor, his expensive designer suit ruined, and his face completely drained of color as he watched the guards close in on my position. The wealthy elite donors who had just been sipping champagne were now backing away in pure horror, holding their mobile phones and reading the horrific truth about the starving child locked in the closet. The entire glamorous facade was rapidly crumbling into absolute chaos. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still behind the crystal podium, gripping the microphone with absolute steady confidence because I knew something the arrogant, bankrupt political monster screaming from the front row did not know. Just as the lead security contractor reached out his heavy hand to violently grab my shoulder, a massive, deafening crash echoed from the back of the room. The heavy, ornate brass doors of the grand ballroom were violently kicked open, slamming so hard against the walls that the expensive plaster literally cracked. A booming, authoritative voice ordered everybody to freeze and drop their weapons. The wealthy, elite guests shrieked in absolute terror as the entire luxurious landscape of the charity gala instantly transformed into a chaotic federal raid. Half a dozen uniformed catering waiters, who had just been quietly serving expensive caviar, suddenly dropped their silver trays, drawing heavy black firearms from beneath their crisp white aprons. Elegant guests in this crowd, who had been quietly mingling and discussing their stock portfolios, ripped off their expensive suit jackets to reveal thick Kevlar vests bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent David Vance marched aggressively down the center aisle of the ballroom, entirely ignoring the panicked shrieks of the wealthy socialites scattering out of his direct path. He was flanked by heavily armed tactical officers who immediately swarmed the private security contractors, forcing them to drop their batons and drop heavily to their knees on the carpet. The armed contractors quickly realized they were completely outmatched by the federal agents and surrendered without a single fight, raising their empty hands into the air. Ashley's father tried to violently shove his way through the chaotic, screaming crowd, desperately making a run for the private service elevator in a pathetic attempt to escape justice. But two undercover agents disguised as bartenders easily tackled him to the floor, pinning his heavy arms brutally behind his back. The clinking sound of cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his thick wrists echoed through the room like the ultimate financial guillotine finally dropping on his fake bankrupt empire. The corrupt senator who had been standing next to him frantically tried to delete emails from his mobile phone, but an agent swiftly snatched the device from his trembling hands and slammed him forcefully against the wall. Agent Vance confidently climbed the carpeted stairs and joined me on the glowing stage holding a thick stack of federal warrants. He did not even look at Terrence, who was currently sliding down the broken speaker monitor, sobbing pathetically into his hands. The veteran federal agent stepped up to the crystal podium, leaned into the microphone, and projected his deep, commanding voice across the terrified, silent ballroom. He announced with cold, absolute precision that exactly 2 minutes ago, the federal government had completely frozen every single offshore asset shell company and domestic bank account tied to the Wilson family and their fraudulent political allies. Agent Vance explained to the horrified crowd that the fake charity foundation was officially dissolved and the massive $15 million trust fund belonging to an innocent little boy had been fully secured by the federal courts, completely preventing the corrupt medical board from ever receiving their illegal blood money payoff. The heavy, crushing reality of their total, absolute ruin finally crashed down on the arrogant monsters who had tortured my sweet nephew. Terrence was violently yanked up from the floor by his expensive collar and aggressively handcuffed while my parents cowered in the corner, crying pathetic tears of absolute humiliation as their precious social status evaporated into thin air. They had spent their entire lives worshiping money and power, and now they were watching their only connection to wealth being dragged away in chains. My mother Yvonne tried to reach out to one of the federal agents claiming she was innocent and had no idea about the abuse, but the officer simply ordered her to step back and remain silent. My father Calvin stared at the floor, entirely broken, his lifelong obsession with appearances finally destroyed by the undeniable digital proof of his own son's horrifying crimes. But it was Ashley who provided the most horrifying spectacle of the entire night. Two female federal agents grabbed her arms to place her under arrest, and she completely lost her mind. The flawless, elegant influencer persona shattered into a million sharp pieces. She kicked and thrashed violently against the officers, her expensive custom diamond necklace snapping and scattering sparkling gems across the polished stage floor like cheap glass. Her face was twisted into a demonic mask of pure evil as the agents forced her arms behind her back and clamped the heavy steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. She fought like a rabid animal, realizing her entire fake wealthy existence was dead forever, and that she would be trading her luxury mansion for a cold concrete federal prison cell. She locked her wild, crazed eyes directly onto mine as the officers began dragging her aggressively toward the ballroom exit. She tilted her head back and screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her shrill, desperate voice echoing terribly over the crying crowd. She shrieked that she was still his legal guardian, that she still held the absolute power of attorney, and that no one in the world could ever legally stop the standing do not resuscitate order before midnight. The heavy steel handcuffs clinking violently against Ashley's wrists did not stop her from thrashing like a trapped animal as the two federal agents held her firmly in place. Her shrill, desperate voice echoed terribly through the ballroom, bouncing off the towering ice sculptures as she screamed wildly about her legal rights and her absolute power of attorney. She shrieked that she was still the legal guardian of the dying boy, and that her standing "do not resuscitate" order was completely binding until midnight, making it impossible for anyone to save Jamal. I slowly stepped out from behind the glowing crystal podium, my high heels clicking deliberately against the polished stage floorboards. The entire room of 500 wealthy socialites held their collective breath, standing completely frozen in absolute shock as they watched me descend the carpeted stairs. Agent Vance stood near the front row and calmly held up his tactical gloved hand, signaling his armed federal officers to pause their arrest, allowing me to walk directly toward the bankrupt woman who had tortured my family. I stopped mere inches from Ashley's distorted, panicked face. Her expensive custom makeup was completely smeared across her pale cheeks, running dark, wet tracks down her neck as she glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to spit another vile threat, but I smoothly reached deep into the hidden pocket of my dark evening gown and pulled out a thick folded piece of heavy yellowed parchment. The aged paper felt rough and substantial in my steady hands, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the cheap, glossy hospital directives she had illegally forged. It was the original physical copy of the last will and testament drafted and signed by my brilliant deceased sister-in-law, Alicia. I held the heavy document up to the harsh stage lighting, forcing Ashley to look directly at the black ink and the official golden notary seals pressed into the bottom corner. "You did not read Alicia's will carefully enough," I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold, dangerous whisper that carried perfectly through the dead silence of the ruined charity gala. "You and your father spent all your time aggressively studying the banking spreadsheets and drooling over the massive trust fund routing numbers. But you never bothered to actually read the restrictive legal fine print that protected her only child." Ashley sneered at me, her chest heaving violently as she tried to pull her restrained arms away from the agents, loudly claiming that her local corrupt judges had already permanently sealed the estate, making the old will completely irrelevant. I slowly unfolded the yellowed parchment, my eyes scanning the exact specific paragraph I had meticulously memorized years ago. "Alicia knew exactly what kind of man my brother was," I explained, projecting my voice so the entire wealthy crowd could hear every damning word. I turned and stared directly into Terrence's terrified, pathetic eyes as he cowered helplessly near the broken speaker monitors on the stage. She knew Terrence was a spineless coward who worshipped money and elite social status far above the life of his own flesh and blood. She knew perfectly well that the second she passed away, he would become an incredibly easy target for a greedy, parasitic monster looking for a quick, massive payout to cover their crushing secret debts. I turned my cold, unwavering gaze back to Ashley, watching the arrogant, defiant sneer slowly begin to drain from her smeared face. That is exactly why Alicia secretly included a highly specific airtight morality clause buried incredibly deep inside the impenetrable legal framework of the corporate trust. I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "The ironclad clause explicitly states that if Jamal is ever subjected to any form of physical, medical, or financial neglect, the entire $15 million trust fund and his full legal guardianship automatically and irrevocably transfer completely away from his biological father." Ashley violently shook her head, her tangled blonde hair whipping wildly across her face as she shrieked that local Judge Harmon had officially granted her full, absolute medical proxy yesterday morning, and that no obscure, outdated legal clause could ever override a sitting state judge. Her political father, currently struggling brutally against his own tight steel handcuffs, on the carpeted floor yelled aggressively that their influential family practically owned the local county courts, and that my ancient piece of paper was completely worthless garbage. I offered Ashley a slow, chilling, confident smile, letting her revel in her fake, fragile legal invincibility for one final agonizing second before delivering the ultimate execution blow. I slowly turned to the very last page of the heavy document, revealing a brand new pristine attachment stapled directly over Alicia's original signature. It was a crisp, bright white sheet of premium federal legal stationery bearing the massive, unmistakable embossed seal of the United States District Court. I held the bright white paper directly in front of Ashley's, shaking terrified eyes, pointing my index finger directly at the heavy, bold blue ink signature scrawled across the bottom line. The legal transfer of power goes directly to the designated alternate executor, I whispered, watching the absolute catastrophic horror finally dawn in her wide, panicked eyes. And I am the alternate executor. Ashley let out a guttural, suffocating gasp as her eyes desperately read the undeniable federal mandate. I leaned in even closer, ensuring she felt the crushing weight of her total destruction. That signature belongs to a supreme federal judge, I stated coldly, my words cutting through the air like sharp glass. It was legally granted and fully processed exactly 10 minutes ago by the highest court in the country, bypassing your corrupt local judges entirely and immediately overriding every single forged medical directive your bankrupt family created. Your fake lethal do not resuscitate order is completely void, and you no longer have any right or authority to make a single medical decision for my nephew. I looked up at Agent Vance, who offered a firm confirming nod of absolute respect. A heavy black tactical radio clipped securely to his protective vest suddenly crackled to life, filling the quiet, stunned ballroom with the authoritative, echoing voice of the Federal Hospital Strike Team commander. The commander officially reported over the loud, encrypted channel that the massive federal medical team had just successfully breached Jamal's dark, sterile hospital room across town, and that world-class pediatric specialists were actively stabilizing his fragile heart and immediately administering vital life-saving fluids. The impending midnight deadline was officially destroyed. Ashley's knees physically buckled beneath her expensive ruined evening dress, completely losing all structural support. The two federal agents had to aggressively haul her up by her underarms to prevent her from collapsing completely onto the polished wooden floorboards. She began to weep hysterically, shedding the ugly, desperate tears of a broken woman who suddenly realized she was going to spend the rest of her miserable life rotting inside a cold, dark concrete federal prison cell. I carefully folded the heavy yellowed document and tucked it safely back into my dark evening gown, turning my back forever on the screaming, ruined criminals as the federal agents finally dragged them out of the glamorous ballroom and into the cold, unforgiving justice of the night. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Terrence's wrists echoed like a final definitive gavel strike in the ruined grand ballroom. Agent Vance shoved my brother forcefully against the polished wooden podium to conduct a thorough tactical search of his ruined designer suit. The arrogant, untouchable facade Terrence had hidden behind for his entire miserable life was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a pathetic, trembling coward, sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the federal authorities. The elite wealthy donors had completely evacuated the venue, leaving behind a chaotic wasteland of shattered crystal champagne flutes, overturned velvet chairs, and melting ice sculptures, dripping sadly onto the expensive silk tablecloths. The only people remaining in the massive, echoing room were the heavily armed federal agents actively processing the massive crime scene and the cluster of aggressive local investigative journalists whose flashing camera lenses eagerly captured every single moment of this historic elite downfall. I stood tall and completely unbothered near the edge of the stage, breathing in the cool air of absolute justice, when a sudden frantic movement caught my peripheral vision. My mother, Yvonne, and my father, Calvin, were desperately scrambling up the carpeted stage stairs, completely abandoning their lifelong obsession with upper-class decorum. My mother's expensive designer heels caught on the fabric of her evening gown, causing her to stumble pathetically onto her hands and knees before frantically pulling herself back up. My father was sweating heavily, his face pale and distorted with sheer panic as he aggressively pushed past a federal officer to reach me. They lunged toward my position, their faces streaked with ruined mascara and terrified tears. Yvonne reached out her shaking hands with her expensive manicured nails and desperately grabbed the dark fabric of my elegant evening gown. She looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes, completely ignoring the terrifying reality that her own son had just been arrested for the calculated attempted murder of her helpless grandson. She sobbed hysterically, pulling forcefully on my dress, and begged me to tell the federal agents that this was all a massive misunderstanding. Calvin stepped up right beside her, his voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate urgency as he aggressively pointed at Terrence, who was currently being read his Miranda rights. He told me that I had to immediately drop the federal charges and call off the investigation. He actually looked me dead in the eyes and yelled, "He made a mistake. Don't send a black man to the system." The absolute sheer audacity of his disgusting manipulative plea hung heavily in the dead silence of the stage, entirely captured by the flashing media cameras gathered just a few feet away. My parents were actually trying to weaponize systemic racial trauma to perfectly shield a calculated monster who had willingly starved his own child for a corporate payout. I looked down at their desperate, pathetic faces and felt absolutely nothing but pure freezing contempt. My forensic analytical brain locked onto their deep-seated hypocrisy, and I did not hesitate to completely destroy their fragile, superficial existence. I smoothly ripped my evening gown out of my mother's desperate shaking grip, causing her to stumble backward in shock. I stepped directly toward the flashing media cameras, deliberately projecting my voice so every single journalist could hear the absolute final destruction of my biological family. I looked my father dead in the eye and methodically dismantled his entire pathetic argument. I told them both that it was incredibly fascinating how deeply they suddenly cared about the systemic preservation of a black man when they had spent the last 7 years aggressively worshipping at the altar of Ashley's wealthy white elite family. I exposed their absolute sickening vanity, detailing how they had eagerly turned a blind eye while a corrupt political empire systematically erased our deceased sister-in-law, Alicia, and actively tortured a beautiful, innocent black child locked away in a dark hospital room. I stepped even closer, forcing them to actively shrink back from my absolute, unwavering authority. You did not care about the system when it was being used to forge lethal medical directives to legally execute your own helpless grandson, I stated, my voice echoing like cold thunder across the empty ballroom. You only care now because your proximity to fake elite wealth and country club status is currently wearing federal handcuffs. They stood completely frozen, their mouths opening and closing in silent, humiliating shock as the cameras relentlessly documented their total exposure. I delivered the final execution blow with absolute cold precision, making sure my words would echo in their empty lives forever. You chose a fake status over your own grandson's life, I said, my gaze piercing right through their superficial souls. You aren't my family. You never were. I formally and completely disown you both, right here and right now. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing into my father's arms. But I had already turned my back on them completely, entirely erasing them from my existence. The sheer absolute finality of my public disownment completely shattered whatever tiny fragile thread of hope Terrence was still clinging to. He was currently being forcefully marched down the stage stairs by Agent Vance, but he suddenly dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpet and stopped dead in his tracks. The pathetic coward realized that his parents could not save him and that his wealthy political father-in-law was already in custody. He panicked like a trapped rat and immediately decided to violently throw his own wife under the proverbial bus to save his own skin. Terrence twisted his neck wildly and began screaming at the absolute top of his lungs directly at Agent Vance. He shrieked loudly that he had absolutely nothing to do with the fraudulent hospital paperwork, and that the entire massive starvation plot was completely Ashley's brilliant idea. He frantically yelled that her corrupt father had fabricated the offshore trust accounts to cover his political campaign debts, and that Ashley was the absolute only monster who had physically locked Jamal in that dark closet to slowly die of malnutrition. He begged Agent Vance for total federal immunity, offering to testify against his own wife and his powerful father-in-law in a desperate bid to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. Ashley was currently being forcefully dragged toward the grand double doors by two female federal agents, but she heard every single word of her husband's pathetic, desperate betrayal. Her entire body immediately went completely feral. The flawless, elegant luxury influencer completely snapped, entirely consumed by pure, unhinged, violent rage, knowing her husband was eagerly selling her out to save himself. Despite having her arms securely handcuffed tightly behind her back, Ashley let out a terrifying guttural scream and violently launched her entire body backward, Breaking free from the shocked agent's grip for a fraction of a second, she lunged directly at Terrence like a rabid animal, using her full body weight to brutally headbutt him straight in the middle of his face. The sickening crunch of bone and cartilage echoed loudly across the room as Terrence's nose instantly shattered, sending a bright spray of crimson blood directly onto his crisp white ruined dress shirt. Terrence shrieked in absolute agony, stumbling blindly backward into the wooden podium. The two handcuffed criminals violently crashed onto the polished floorboards, viciously kicking and screaming unhinged obscenities at each other in a chaotic, bloody brawl. The federal tactical agents immediately swarmed them aggressively, dragging the shrieking, thrashing couple apart. Ashley was screaming that she would kill him while Terrence was violently choking on his own blood as they were hauled forcefully out the shattered ballroom doors toward the flashing blue and red lights of the waiting federal cruisers. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the ruined grand ballroom, but I did not have a single second to process the absolute devastation I had just unleashed on my former family. My focus narrowed entirely to the digital clock glowing on Agent Vance's wrist, which currently read 11:35 p.m. We had exactly 25 minutes to cross 12 miles of dense Atlanta traffic before the corrupt local medical board could legally execute their fatal do not resuscitate order. Agent Vance grabbed my elbow and swiftly guided me toward a heavily armored black federal SUV waiting idling at the curb, with its doors already flung wide open. I climbed into the back seat, clutching the heavy yellowed parchment of Alicia's original will and the crisp white federal injunction against my chest like a physical shield. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us inside the reinforced cabin, and the driver immediately hit the gas, sending the massive vehicle surging forward into the humid night. A fleet of federal cruisers flanked us on all sides, their deafening sirens cutting through the dark city streets and their bright flashing red and blue lights painting the passing buildings in a frantic strobe effect. I stared out the tinted window, watching the blur of the city fly past my reflection, mixing with the chaotic lights. Agent Vance sat in the passenger seat, actively coordinating with the hospital strike team over his encrypted tactical radio, his voice low and intensely focused. He relayed the exact floor and room number of the pediatric intensive care unit, confirming that the world-class surgical specialists were currently waiting on standby, but could not legally touch the child until I physically arrived to countermand the forged directives. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming adrenaline coursing through my veins as I realized the entire massive financial empire I had just burned to the ground meant absolutely nothing if we did not beat the clock. The heavy SUV swerved violently around a line of stopped civilian cars, the tires screeching loudly against the asphalt as our driver pushed the powerful engine to its absolute limit, taking every risky shortcut possible to shave precious seconds off our arrival time. The towering glass and steel structure of Atlanta Memorial Hospital finally loomed into view, its massive illuminated emergency signs acting like a beacon in the dark. Our federal convoy did not bother stopping at the visitor entrance, instead tearing aggressively up the curved ambulance ramp and violently throwing the vehicles into park before they had even fully stopped. I shoved the heavy car door open and hit the concrete, running my evening gown billowing behind me as I sprinted alongside Agent Vance and 6 heavily armed tactical officers. We burst through the sliding automatic glass doors, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the triage nurses and the terrified patients sitting in the waiting area. Agent Vance flashed his golden federal badge at the security desk, bypassing the metal detectors entirely and leading our frantic sprint directly toward the private staff elevators. The digital clock above the elevator bank flashed 11:45 p.m., causing a cold knot of pure panic to twist violently in my stomach as we waited agonizing seconds for the metal doors to open. When the doors finally parted on the pediatric floor, we erupted into the sterile, quiet hallway, moving with terrifying speed and absolute purpose. The bright white corridors of the intensive care unit felt like an icy labyrinth, but my internal compass was locked entirely on my nephew's room. As we violently rounded the final corner at exactly 11:50 p.m., the horrifying scene unfolding inside room 402 stopped the breath completely in my lungs. Ashley's corrupt uncle, Dr. Richard Hawkins, The chief of cardiology, who had orchestrated the fake medical evaluations, stood completely alone over Jamal's fragile, emaciated body. The private hospital room was bathed in the eerie blue glow of the life support monitors, displaying my sweet nephew's dangerously shallow vital signs. Hawkins had explicitly ordered all the attending nurses to leave the floor, securing his complete privacy to execute the final phase of their murderous financial plot. I watched in absolute sheer horror through the glass observation window as the corrupt doctor slowly reached his gloved hand toward the primary ventilator controls, his fingers hovering mere inches above the power switch that would permanently silence Jamal's struggling lungs. He did not even look at the beautiful, innocent boy lying broken on the mattress. His eyes were entirely fixed on the wall clock, counting down the final convenient minutes to midnight. "Drop your hands and step away from the bed right now," Agent Vance roared, kicking the heavy wooden hospital door open with such explosive physical force that the metal handle dented the interior drywall. Hawkins violently flinched, his arrogant face instantly draining of all color as half a dozen federal rifles aimed directly at his chest, and the small red targeting lasers painted bright dots across his crisp white medical coat. The corrupt doctor raised his trembling hands into the air, frantically stammering that he was simply adjusting the oxygen flow and performing his legal duties under the standing "do not resuscitate" mandate. A tactical officer aggressively grabbed Hawkins by his expensive silk tie, spinning him around and slamming him forcefully face first against the sterile white wall before violently ratcheting heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. "You are under federal arrest for attempted murder and criminal medical conspiracy, Agent," Vance stated coldly, completely ignoring the doctor's pathetic whining excuses as the officers forcefully dragged the ruined man out of the pediatric room. I rushed immediately to the side of the hospital bed, my heart breaking into a million jagged pieces as I finally looked down at the tiny, fragile frame of my sister-in-law's only child. Jamal looked incredibly small, engulfed by the massive medical equipment, his beautiful face pale and his tiny chest barely moving beneath the thin hospital blanket. A team of 5 elite pediatric surgeons, dressed in pristine blue scrubs, rushed into the room, immediately trailing right behind the federal agents. The lead surgeon, a brilliant woman named Dr. Eris, approached me quickly, holding a thick metal clipboard filled with emergency surgical consent forms. "We need absolute legal clearance to operate immediately," she stated, her voice tight with urgent medical authority. "The standing directives prohibit us from administering the experimental cardiac bypass surgery that will save his life, and the procedure requires a massive upfront financial authorization." I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I slammed the heavy yellowed parchment of Alicia's original will and the crisp white federal injunction directly onto the rolling medical tray. "I legally revoke the fraudulent "do not resuscitate" order," I commanded, projecting my voice so every single medical professional in the room heard my absolute authority. As the alternate executor of the estate and his sole legal guardian, I authorize any and all life-saving medical procedures required. I grabbed a black pen from the doctor's hand and aggressively signed my name across the bottom of the surgical consent forms, securing their legal protection. "The massive trust fund is completely unfrozen and fully under my direct control," I stated, locking eyes with the lead surgeon. "You have unlimited financial resources to save my nephew. Use absolutely everything you have to bring him back to me." Dr. Eris offered a firm nod of deep respect, instantly turning to her surgical team and barking out a rapid series of complex medical commands. The previously quiet room erupted into a highly coordinated frenzy of controlled medical chaos as the nurses began frantically unhooking Jamal's bed from the wall monitors, preparing to aggressively transport him down the hall. They pushed the heavy rolling gurney forward, maneuvering the fragile boy toward the double doors that led directly to the emergency operating theater. I walked closely beside the moving bed, gently holding Jamal's tiny cold hand in mine, whispering soft promises that he was finally safe and that his Aunt Jasmine was never going to leave him alone ever again. We pushed through the swinging doors into the bright, harsh fluorescent lighting of the surgical hallway, the doctors moving at a dead sprint. But just as the heavy wheels of the gurney crossed the threshold of the operating room, A sudden, horrifying sound completely shattered the frantic momentum. The rhythmic, fragile beeping of Jamal's cardiac monitor abruptly stopped. The green digital line tracking his heartbeat flatlined across the glowing screen, transforming into a solid horizontal streak. A long, piercing, terrifying, continuous beep filled the sterile white hallway, freezing the blood completely in my veins as the lead surgeon shouted for an immediate crash cart, and the violent race for his life truly began. The piercing, continuous tone of the flatlining cardiac monitor sliced through the sterile hallway like a physical blade, instantly freezing the blood in my veins. Dr. Eris did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second, barking rapid-fire commands as her elite surgical team violently crashed through the heavy double doors of the operating theater. I was brutally shoved backward against the cold tiled wall by a rushing swarm of scrub-clad nurses hauling crash carts and heavy defibrillator units. The heavy metal doors swung shut, cutting off my view of my dying nephew, but the horrific, chaotic sounds of the desperate medical battle echoed through the small glass observation window. I slid down the slick wall until I hit the linoleum floor, pulling my knees tight to my chest as the excruciating hours began to drag past. The glowing red numbers on the digital wall clock taunted me, mocking my complete helplessness as the surgery stretched from 2 hours into 5 and then into an agonizing 8. My evening gown was ruined, stained with sweat, and the sterile chemical smell of the hospital, but I refused to leave the waiting area for a single second. Finally, after 10 excruciating hours of absolute medical warfare, the heavy operating doors slowly hissed open, revealing Dr. Eris covered in surgical fluids and looking incredibly exhausted. She pulled down her blue paper mask and offered me the most beautiful, exhausted smile I had ever seen in my entire life, telling me that they had successfully repaired the severe cardiac damage and that Jamal's fragile heart was finally beating entirely on its own. The next several weeks blurred into a quiet, dedicated vigil beside his small hospital bed, inside the pediatric intensive care unit. The federal agents had permanently stationed 2 armed guards outside his door, guaranteeing his absolute safety from any outside interference, while my brother and his wife rotted in federal holding cells. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair day and night, gently reading my favorite childhood books to his sleeping form and holding his tiny hand to let him know he was entirely safe. The slow, miraculous process of his healing was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. The hollow, dark circles under his eyes slowly faded as the aggressive intravenous nutrition therapies completely reversed the horrific effects of his prolonged starvation. The turning point arrived on a quiet, rainy Tuesday morning when I felt a weak, tiny squeeze against my fingers. I gasped, dropping my book as Jamal's heavy eyelids fluttered and slowly opened, revealing bright, curious eyes that looked around the bright room before finally locking onto my face. He offered a small, weak smile, calling me Auntie Jasmine in a raspy, fragile whisper that completely broke whatever remained of my heart. I wept openly, pressing my face against his warm little hand, promising him over and over again that the bad people were gone forever and that he was going to come home with me to a life filled with nothing but absolute safety and unconditional love. His physical recovery accelerated rapidly after that morning, transforming him from a broken, starving victim back into the vibrant, intelligent little boy his mother Alicia had always known he could be. Fast forward, exactly 6 months, to the towering, polished mahogany walls of the United States Federal Courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The atmosphere inside the massive courtroom was thick with electric anticipation as the highly publicized trial of Terrence and Ashley finally commenced. The wealthy, corrupt political empire belonging to Ashley's father had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of the federal asset freezes. But they had somehow managed to scrounge together enough hidden cash to hire a team of slick, aggressive corporate defense attorneys. The high-priced lawyers strutted around the courtroom in custom-tailored suits, desperately attempting to broker a last-minute plea bargain behind closed doors, offering reduced charges in exchange for full confessions. They tried to argue that their clients were under severe financial duress and requested leniency, claiming the horrific starvation was a misguided medical decision rather than calculated attempted murder. But they completely underestimated the absolute devastating power of my digital forensic accounting. I took the witness stand with cold, absolute confidence, staring dead into the terrified eyes of my brother and his ruined wife as they sat handcuffed to the defense table in matching orange federal prison jumpsuits. I systematically dismantled every single pathetic lie their expensive lawyers tried to present meticulously, guiding the federal jury through the complex web of offshore shell companies and fraudulent bank transfers. I presented undeniable digital proof that Terrence and Ashley had actively diverted millions of dollars from the trust fund to purchase luxury vehicles and designer vacations, while simultaneously forging lethal medical documents to starve a helpless child to death. My forensic evidence left absolutely zero room for reasonable doubt, completely obliterating their expensive legal defense in a matter of hours. The presiding federal judge, a stern, brilliant woman named Judge Carter, did not even attempt to hide her absolute physical disgust as she looked down at the two broken monsters sitting at the defense table. The courtroom was dead silent as she delivered her final scathing remarks, completely tearing apart their arrogant, privileged facade. She stated clearly for the official public record that in her 30 years on the federal bench, she had never witnessed a more horrifying case of calculated child abuse and financial predation. She looked directly at Terrence, calling him a profound disgrace to humanity for actively participating in the slow, tortured murder of his own biological flesh and blood simply to maintain a fake, wealthy lifestyle. She then turned her freezing gaze to Ashley, stripping away the last remaining shreds of her ruined influencer persona by officially declaring her a sociopathic predator. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a deafening crack as Judge Carter handed down the absolute maximum sentence allowable under federal law. She sentenced both Terrence and Ashley to exactly 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, explicitly mandating that there would be absolutely no chance of early parole or early release for good behavior. But the final execution blow came when the judge turned to the financial restitution phase of the sentencing. She officially ordered the immediate total liquidation of Ashley's family's entire remaining estate, including their luxury mansions, foreign accounts, and hidden political assets. Every single penny generated from their total ruin was ordered to be irrevocably transferred directly into a protected blind trust for Jamal, ensuring that the corrupt monsters who tried to destroy his life would end up funding his bright, beautiful future forever. Exactly 1 year later, the warm morning sunlight streamed through the massive bay windows of our sprawling estate, illuminating the peaceful air. The rich smell of cinnamon pancakes drifted through the pristine, open-concept kitchen, replacing the sterile chemical stench of the hospital that had haunted my nightmares. I stood leaning against the marble island, holding a warm ceramic mug, and watched the most beautiful sight my eyes had ever witnessed. Jamal was actively sprinting across the lush green lawn of the secure backyard, chasing a golden retriever puppy we had adopted just 3 months ago. His formerly emaciated frame was now completely filled out with healthy, vibrant muscle, and his beautiful face glowed with a bright, rosy warmth that radiated pure childhood joy. His loud, infectious laughter echoed through the open glass patio doors, completely erasing the agonizing silence of that dark room. The federal restitution mandates had permanently secured his financial future. But the absolute unconditional love filling these walls was what had truly brought him back to life. He tackled the puppy gently into the soft grass, completely free from the suffocating shadow of the monsters who had tried to destroy him. I took a deep breath, feeling the profound serenity that came from knowing he would never be hurt ever again. The sudden sharp chime of the perimeter security system echoed softly through the quiet house, instantly pulling me from my peaceful reverie. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter and walked unhurriedly toward the glowing digital command center mounted on the hallway wall. I tapped the high-definition screen, bringing up the live video feed from the reinforced wrought iron front gate located at the edge of the private property. The crisp camera lens revealed two incredibly pathetic figures standing desperately in the morning drizzle. It took my brain a fraction of a second to fully register. that the two ruined, miserable people, staring pleadingly into the security camera, were my biological parents, Calvin and Yvonne. They looked absolutely catastrophic, having visually aged at least a decade in the span of a single 12-month period. Yvonne was no longer draped in the expensive designer silks she had constantly flaunted during her days of worshipping Ashley's corrupt elite family. Calvin stood beside her, looking completely broken, his shoulders slumped forward in absolute defeat, as the devastating reality of their total social and financial ruin weighed heavily on his aging frame. The federal liquidation of their precious in-laws, empire had completely severed their proximity to the fake wealth they valued above their own flesh and blood. Yvonne aggressively pushed the call button on the gate panel again, her face distorting into a mask of desperate fake maternal affection as she peered into the lens. Her voice crackled through the intercom speaker, sounding thin and pathetic as she begged me to open the gate and let them inside. She rambled frantically about how much they deeply regretted the terrible mistakes of the past, and how they had spent the last year suffering in absolute misery. Calvin leaned into the microphone right beside her, his voice breaking as he shamelessly weaponized my nephew's existence to gain entry. He pleaded that they just wanted to see their beautiful grandson, that they wanted to be a part of his miraculous recovery. They were actively trying to rewrite history, entirely ignoring the undeniable fact that they had eagerly let him starve just to maintain their country club status. I stood perfectly still in the warm hallway, watching their pathetic, desperate performance, with absolutely zero emotional reaction. The fierce rage that had fueled my vengeance a year ago had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, impenetrable armor of absolute indifference. I slowly reached out and pressed the brass intercom button, allowing my calm, steady voice to broadcast directly through the heavy iron gate. I did not yell, and I did not offer any lengthy emotional explanations because they were no longer worthy of my energy. I stared into the monitor, watching their eyes widen with fragile hope as the speaker clicked to life. "This table is for family only," I stated, my voice echoing with a quiet, lethal finality that completely shattered the damp morning air. The fragile hope instantly violently drained from their ruined faces, as the absolute gravity of my words struck them like a physical blow. Yvonne let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing against the heavy iron bars, begging me not to do this, but I was already entirely done. I smoothly lifted my finger from the intercom button, permanently cutting off the audio feed and silencing their pathetic, desperate cries forever. I typed a rapid sequence of commands into the digital security panel, officially flagging their facial recognition profiles and permanently blocking their access from ever ringing the estate gate again. The screen faded to black entirely, erasing them from my existence without a single ounce of hesitation. I turned my back on the monitor and walked smoothly back into the kitchen, just as Jamal ran through the patio doors, panting happily. He looked up at me with his bright, beautiful eyes and asked if I wanted to help him build a massive fortress out of the couch cushions. I smiled warmly, wrapping my arms tightly around his healthy body, and told him there was absolutely nothing in the world I would rather do. The scene seamlessly transitions away from the warm, sunlit house, instantly shifting to the sleek, polished glass and steel architecture of a towering office building located in the very heart of downtown Atlanta. The camera glides smoothly through a set of heavy, pristine glass double doors, revealing a bustling, highly sophisticated corporate workspace. The silver lettering mounted elegantly on the dark mahogany reception wall proudly displays the name of my newly established firm. The operation had been fully funded and meticulously built, using a strategic portion of the massive federal restitution funds legally seized from the criminals who had tortured my family. It was a highly specialized elite forensic accounting agency entirely dedicated to a single relentless mission. We operated as a ruthless financial strike team, aggressively auditing corrupt family trusts, exposing hidden offshore accounts, and actively hunting down financial predators who attempted to exploit marginalized, vulnerable children. I walked confidently through the center of the busy bullpen, my designer heels clicking with absolute authority against the polished concrete floor. My team offered respectful nods and deferential smiles as I passed, completely acknowledging the powerful protective force I had become in the corporate financial world. I pushed open the heavy glass door to my expansive corner office, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding, undisputed view of the entire city skyline. My desk was a pristine slab of minimalist black marble, completely clear of clutter except for a single glowing computer monitor and a heavy, thick manila folder resting squarely in the center of the leather blotter. I walked around this desk and settled smoothly into my high-backed leather chair, feeling the absolute profound weight of my true purpose. I had successfully transformed the darkest, most agonizing trauma of my life into a lethal, unstoppable weapon for justice, ensuring that no other helpless child would ever be locked in the dark for the sake of elite greed. I looked directly into the camera, offering a slow, confident, and absolutely terrifying smile that promised complete destruction to anyone who dared to harm the innocent. I smoothly reached forward and flipped open the cover of the brand new case file, ready to burn another corrupt empire to the ground. Fade to black. The story of Jasmine illustrates that true power stems from integrity and an uncompromising pursuit of truth, rather than the hollow facades of wealth and social status. When confronted with systemic corruption and betrayal, Jasmine proved that resilience and analytical precision can dismantle even the most deceptive illusions. It serves as a stark reminder that predators often weaponize perfection to mask cruelty. Ultimately, this narrative teaches us that protecting the vulnerable requires both the courage to confront evil directly and the diligence to follow the facts, demonstrating that justice is achievable when we refuse to be silenced by powerful threats. If you witness exploitation or abuse, do not remain a bystander. Gather evidence, trust your instincts, and speak up to demand justice for those who cannot protect themselves.